Welcome to this explainer. Picture, if you will, a harsh, desolate landscape. The late afternoon sun is turning from honey gold to a dark blood red over the jagged peaks of Mount Taygetus. The wind is howling through the valley, blowing coarse dust across a heavily worn, rusted Spartan shield, lying half-buried in the barren dirt. Its proud lambda symbol, deeply scarred. For centuries, you see, Sparta stood as an invincible monument, a state of iron that believed its dominance was simply eternal. But today, we're going to explore how the supposedly perfect war machine actually committed suicide from within, centuries before its final battle. The fall of a civilization rarely begins with the roar of cannons. That haunting reality really sets our tone today, because history, well, it's rarely as sudden as it seems. We're going to see how Sparta rotted from the inside out. This decay was hidden in the silent, dark rooms of the elite, fueled by a blind apathy and extreme arrogance that slowly suffocated the very soldiers meant to protect them, long before foreign armies ever arrived at their borders. Let's start with Section 1, the shattered myth and the illusion of the invincible warrior state. We've all heard the phrase, "come back with your shield or on it." We've been taught the popular history of Sparta, right? This pure, fearless society of equals that despised material wealth, dedicating every single breath to the state. We know the legends of Thermopylae and this famous ethos of absolute bravery. But this austere myth was actually a closed system. It elevated suffering into an unchangeable religion, deliberately designed to paralyze critical thought. It's much like a perfect sheet of ice on a winter lake. From above, it looks flawless, transparent, and unbreakable. But beneath the surface, warm currents are causing invisible cracks, leaving the whole thing brittle and ready to collapse under a single heavy footstep. So it's absolutely crucial to ask, why did the most elite military in the Mediterranean refuse to build stone walls around their city? History usually tells us it was pride, that their men were the only walls they'd ever need. But when we strip away that myth, we uncover a much darker reality. They were a state absolutely terrified of the ground beneath their own feet. The truly unsettling truth here is that Sparta's lack of walls wasn't due to pride at all. Their entire army was, in reality, a massive internal police force. They literally couldn't march away from their valley for more than a few days. They were permanently kept at home out of fear. Their greatest nightmare wasn't the armies of Athens or the vast empires of Persia. It was the captive Helot farmers living right beside them, who they feared would rise up and slit their throats in the dark. And we have the physical archaeological evidence to completely shatter this myth of the unbothered warrior. Data from ancient Linear B clay tablets proves that Sparta's primary exhausting focus wasn't glorious foreign conquest, but managing severe internal slave instability. The ledgers actually show exact grain quotas extracted from their subjects in Messenia, accompanied by these really anxious warnings of unrest. They were a society living under a state of permanent internal siege. Moving on to Section 2, the iron deception, the hidden rot of the Spartan economy. To supposedly prevent greed and maintain this brotherhood of equals, the legendary lawmaker Lycurgus banned the use of gold and silver. Instead, he forced citizens to use useless, heavy iron bars for money, currency that was entirely worthless for international trade. The goal was to intentionally freeze the economy to protect Spartan purity. But as we'll see, this was a masterful, calculated illusion. When we look at the public rule versus the elite reality, it reveals perhaps the greatest historical deception by a ruling class. This system of iron money wasn't created to maintain equality. It was weaponized to bankrupt the middle class. By forcing ordinary citizens to rely on rigid state provisions and worthless iron, the ruling class successfully prevented them from ever accumulating any independent wealth or power. And we know this for sure because deep beneath the sacred grounds of the Temple of Artemis Orthia, modern archaeologists unearthed the proof. They found hidden clay pots buried in deep soil layers containing intact, gleaming silver tetradrachms from Athens and Aegina. So while ordinary warriors bled for the state and suffered with rusted iron, The ruling families, the elders of the Gerousia, secretly hoarded foreign silver right beneath their temples and private estates. This extreme hoarding had devastating consequences, eventually leading to a phenomenon known as oligoanthropia, a severe shortage of free men. Through clever intermarriages and toxic inheritance laws, the lush lands of the Eurotas Valley became concentrated into the hands of a few ultra-wealthy families. Imagine being a scarred veteran returning home only to find your ancestral land absorbed by a wealthy elite, stripping you of your citizenship because you could no longer afford your public meals. This greed devastated the population of free citizens they needed to run their perfect war machine. They built a flawless machine but forgot it actually needed living men to operate it. Which brings us to Section 3, the Silent Society, the deeply human consequence of this internal decay. What follows is the slow erasure of human dignity. Stripped of their land and unable to contribute to the common meals, the Syssitia, these once proud warriors were simply cast out. Exhausted veterans fell into a collective depression. The streets went quiet. Marriages were no longer about building a family. They became calculated real estate transactions for the rich. And the poorer citizens, they simply stopped having children. They refused to bring new life into a society that offered them absolutely no future, only the looming threat of enslavement. We can actually trace the psychological collapse right in their physical art. Back in the 5th century BC, the lead votive figurines left at the temples were exquisite and highly detailed, but as time goes on, the quantity of those offerings drops drastically, and by the later years, the craftsmanship becomes crude, deformed, and heavily distorted. This proves the total collapse of their domestic artisan economy. It's literally the physical fingerprint of a deeply isolated, self-destructing society that had entirely lost its soul. Now let's look at Section 4, the Eternal Warning, and the civilizational cycle of collapse. History rarely repeats in the exact same way, but the patterns of institutional arrogance are eternal. When a massive system begins to replace living reality with abstract metrics just to maintain an illusion of control, it destroys its own ability to adapt to the real world. It's exactly like a blind sea captain standing in a warm, comfortable cabin, trusting his polished pressure gauges because the needles are all in the green. He's completely unaware that outside ice is tearing the hull apart and freezing waters already rising around the ankles of his engineers in the engine room. We can draw a direct line between the past and the present here. Those ancient iron bars were just Sparta's version of extreme optimization, rigid rules meant to enforce an artificial reality. Today, we have modern abstract metrics, complex administrative indices, vast bureaucracies, and virtual numbers that we often mistake for actual societal health. This obsession with preserving rigid institutions is a fatal denominator for any civilization. And the Earth always remembers the truth. Paleopollen data extracted from the ancient mud of the Eurotas Valley reveals an undeniable reality. A sudden, sharp drop in cereal grain pollen, which is then replaced by a massive increase in thorny weeds. By the 4th century BC, the soil itself was dying. It completely exposes the elite's fake reports of prosperity. You can falsify administrative ledgers all you want, but you cannot fake the death of the land. This brings us to our conclusion, the philosophical aftertaste. A civilization already judged by history. In the year 371 BC, at the Battle of Leuctra, the invincible Spartan phalanx was finally decisively crushed by the armies of Thebes. The illusion was broken. But that military defeat was merely the final hammer blow on a coffin they had been building for themselves over centuries. Sparta didn't fall because a physical wall collapsed. Remember, they had no walls. They fell because the invisible walls of their own minds, their extreme arrogance, their terror of change, and a total disconnect from their own people, crushed them from within. They turned themselves into stone long before the enemy ever arrived. I want to leave you with this final, chilling thought to consider as you look at the complex systems, institutions, and metrics around us today. Empires rarely fall just because they weaken. They fall because they stop looking at the truth. Are we repeating their mistakes? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.